We're going to end the week looking at more recent history, looking at safety issues, and then you'll get a chance to hear a couple clinicians speak to you about how they handle figuring out how to help their clients. And here we go. Pharmacognosy and pharmacology, two different things here. Pharmacognosy, people don't really do that anymore because primarily what you're doing is looking at the source and quality of plant materials. The science of drugs that originate from living things as opposed to drugs that are synthesized or combined from just straight up chemicals. So living things, pharmacognosy, uses effects of modes of drug action, pharmacology. And so what happens with pharmacognosy, what the drug companies used to do was source their drugs from plant material. And so they would hire lots of people to go identify and obtain plant material. So I have a little story for you about that. Personal interest for me. My grandfather was a professor of pharmacology at Cal State, Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. And before he ended up there, he had he traveled, he lived in a number of places. My mother grew up in a number of different places. And one of the things that they used to do in the summers that my mother remembers very vividly was they would collect plants for pharmaceutical companies. There are a couple different companies that he would collect for, and he employed the children, and they learned very, very well how to identify various plants that he was collecting. She said some of them were just absolutely miserable to collect. Not only was it hot and they would be working all day, and she's got her grandmother saying, don't take a rest now. The time you should take a rest is when it's, anyway, just hard work. So he would collect many, like thousands of pounds of plants and dry them and ship them to the drug company. And this was in the 1940s and 1950s. And so my mother said that she said, we're just like migrant workers today. They just worked so hard doing this as a way of earning money for him. So one of the interesting things there that he ran across as he was identifying plants, this was a little bit later when they lived in California, was he ran across a variant of an angelica plant that had not yet been named or classified specifically. And so they call this variant of angelica after him, Callii, Callii. So he gets the Latin name looking at that variant. And you can see, if you expand your screen, you can see his name there, Tracy and Viola Call, when they collected this in I can't see it. Okay, this is going to be funny. Maybe it says 1964, but not important. All right, here's another picture of the same thing. And you can see in this picture, this is how herbs would be recorded and classified. And you would have this kind of a document where you can compare colors, given your basic color set there up in the upper left to gauge from. You've got a measurement. You have all the different parts of the plant so that you can see what they look like. There's aerial parts, and those are the parts above the ground. And then there's the root, which was, obviously be below ground. So I thought that might be kind of interesting for you to see. That's a little bit how they do it. And pharmaceutical companies used to source so much from plants. Now they really don't. Resurgence of herbalism happened just around that time when they stopped collecting herbs for use. People started becoming much more interested in herbalism again in the 60s and onward. There's this interest in preventive care that happened. People weren't very interested in preventive care before. It wasn't seen as something that was useful for some. It's hard for us to understand, but this interest in self-care is kind of recent. There's also this backlash against technology that's been happening. Medical schools are beginning to teach a little bit about alternative medicine, but it's really more like, this is what's out there. Here's what you do, but these are some of the alternatives that are out there, just so you know. It's not like they're really learning much at all about them. They may know they exist, maybe. Just like nutrition, medical schools teach very little in the way of nutrition. You know, you might be lucky to get 20 hours of nutrition classes. So let's talk about what is herbalism. I know we mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but CAM covers this idea of complementary and alternative medicine. That's what we call CAM. CAM is this big, huge umbrella term. Every single thing that is not conventional medicine goes under the CAM umbrella. And so when you try and say, well, all CAM is, you're comparing everything, comparing all kinds of things. There's no way to make a comparison, really, because they're all so different. We do know that 80% of the world uses some form of traditional medicine. We're a little bit unusual here in the United States, where we're focusing primarily on conventional Western medicine, as opposed, and really like it, not doing much with any traditional forms of medicine, where many people in the rest of the world use traditional medicine extensively. Herbalism is not homeopathy, like we talked about. A homeopath is not an herbalist. It might also be an herbalist, but that would be two different things. Chiropractic is not herbalism. You might have a chiropractor who is also an herbalist, again, but two different things. Not acupuncture, not Reiki, any of those things. You can be an herbalist and be something else, but herbalism is not the same as all of those other things. Homeopathy is not the same as any of those other things, except for homeopathy itself. There are myths surrounding herbs and herb safety, herb practices. One of the myths, the biggest myth, I think, is that herbs are unregulated. So people say this a lot. They'll say, oh, well, you know, you can sell anything. Herbs are totally unregulated. You know, it's just, and that's not actually true. Herbs are actually regulated. We're going to talk about that in a sec. Another myth is that herbs are only good for minor problems. And that's really mistaken thinking. It just betrays a lack of understanding of what herbs can do for your health and how your body can work from the point of view of an herbalist. There's a myth that if it's natural, that means it's good. And I think that myth has been dismantled a fair amount, so that you certainly understand, just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's wonderful and good, right? And a lot of times people will say, well, you know, poisonous snakes are natural, or poison hemlock is natural. And I wouldn't recommend either of those for your playthings. Okay, herbs aren't backed by research. That's just so ignorant. I can hardly even speak about it. Herbs are not backed by research. Give me a break. You know, you clearly have not investigated anything, if that's what you think. Herbs are all safe. That's also, of course, not true. They're not all safe. They're not like you can just go eat anything and it's fine. You need to use herbs judiciously. You may recognize that term, with judicious thinking. Okay, so we talked about regulating herbs. GMP, good manufacturing practices. These are regulations for dietary supplements. Yes, you don't need FDA approval, because FDA approval implies some other parameters that aren't really applicable to herbs. So it's not because we're going to hold them to a lesser standard as much as that is apples and oranges. And so herbs, supplements have to be on the FDA notification list. The FDA has to be notified of every single product and what's in that product. They need evidence that demonstrates safety. And so herbs have to be safe for their intended use. If you make any claims, and you can't make any disease claims, you can't say this cures anything. The FDA does not allow you to say this will help with uh, Crohn's disease, or this will help with irritable bowel syndrome. Not allowed to say that. You can say this can be a digestive aid. That's what you can say. So that would be a structure function kind of claim. And you have to have some evidence that would support that claim. So how it affects the body functioning, but again, you cannot claim to treat any disease or any condition. And so herbalists are generally very, very careful about that. And so they don't diagnose, and they don't tell you this will help treat your IBS or whatever it is. They can say this will help support your stomach, this will reduce, flatulence maybe, this will ease stomach cramping. You can say those kinds of things. GMP practices, good manufacturing practices, mean that you are testing for a number of things. And so I consult for an herb company, and they're really, like OCD about testing. Again, something I totally approve of. If you're going to be OCD about anything, be OCD about safety, purity, etc. That's fantastic. And so they're constantly doing this, testing whatever they walk by practically. So they're testing it for purity, for strength, for composition, what's in the product. And they want to justify that each test is the right test for this, and that each product component can be traced all the way from the field that it was raised in. So in that sense, you can see the idea that herbs are totally unregulated and you can just throw whatever in a bottle and sell it. That doesn't make very much sense. One of the things that's going around is this idea of like a barcode kind of testing, looking at what the composition of the herb is as read by a machine. Unreliable. That's the problem. People will say, oh, we looked at this and it's just plant material from random house plants. The problem is that kind of testing is unreliable. And so you cannot say for sure using that testing, it doesn't hold validity. And so I would not get too worried about those claims yet. On the other hand, you definitely want to be very skeptical when choosing herb products. There are plenty of companies out there who will go by good manufacturing practices, but there's a lot between good manufacturing practices and getting a really good quality herb, because some of the things that affect how potent an herb is are things like the kind of environment it was grown in, how it was harvested, when during the day it was harvested, whether there have been enough rain or not enough rain. There are lots and lots of things that affect the potency of the product, not just safety, but the quality. And so a good herbal product that is really high quality is likely to be more expensive than just the herb that you got from a field where they just harvested it. However, maybe they harvested and just picked the entire plant and threw it in, instead of choosing the parts of the plants that are actually really useful for your purpose. So there are lots of ways in which you can go by good manufacturing practices and still create a product that is not a quality product. So be careful, because if something is cheap, there's probably a reason why it's cheap. It's probably because it's not as good quality, because quality costs. And so when some companies sell their herbs for more than other companies, you have to get to know the company and understand where they're sourcing, what is their quality, what are their marketing claims. Sometimes companies will market things and they misread the science, or people will write blogs about things and they don't understand the science, and so they misread it. Sometimes the science is just not done very well. And what you're looking for when you're using herbalism as a model of creating good health, you're looking at the individual. You're not looking at what's the standard dose for XYZ. The standard dose that works for all of the people may not work for you. And what we're always looking for is what works for you, because you are unique. Safety. So you read for today this chapter by Castleman on safety, the tempest in a teapot thing. And so this is a very conservative point of view. He gets a little more ramped up about safety than other writers who are less concerned than he is about safety. But I like going with his point of view because it's always better to be safer. And so let's lean toward being safe. Herbs can be very, very safe. They can be, but again, judicious. You have to know stuff. You have to know enough to understand what you're doing. You can't just willy-nilly go start collecting things and ingesting them without really knowing what you're doing. That's not judicious. Some herbs can be dangerous. Some herbs can be dangerous when you have a lot of them, but perfectly safe when you have just a little bit. Some herbs are tested by using so much that it's impossible to ingest that much. And then scientists might say, well, if you use like a huge ton of this, then you're going to have trouble with your liver. Well, the same is true with pretty much anything. You know, have you been to fast food lately? If you have a ton of that, I think you're going to have trouble with your liver. And so you want to look at how much are you actually using. Some herbs can be dangerous, but sometimes they're not dangerous unless you have too much of them. Sometimes even a little bit is dangerous. I went out walking the other day and I saw a poison hemlock. And I'm thinking, in fact, I pointed it out to my kids. I took a picture of it and I showed it to them and I said, just in case, I mean, they're in college, so they're probably not going to be out eating a lot of plants, but you never know. Just in case, don't eat this plant. I don't know why you'd be walking by the river and decide to run over there and start munching on this, but just know it's poison hemlock. So you have to be careful. Poisonous plants do exist. Most people also don't have a really good understanding of their body or how to listen to their body. We are also kind of stressed out as people, and the more stressed out you are, the harder it is to hear your body and to listen to what it's telling you. This is a skill, and we have grown up without practicing this skill for the most part. And so you want to listen to your body so that you can get a sense of how you are responding to any particular herbs. If you don't have a good sense of how to read your body or listen to what it's saying or be aware of any small, subtle physiological changes or psychological changes, and then you start taking an herb, you may not notice the changes that it's making because you can't measure them. It's like your ruler is sort of, fuzzy. Some herbs break down really quickly. Some herbs break down slowly. Some herbs speed up your liver. Some herbs slow down how your liver metabolizes things. And so that can affect pharmaceutical medication you're taking. And so that's something to keep in mind. If you're taking an herb that speeds up metabolism such that the pharmaceutical that you need to take is not getting absorbed as quickly or as thoroughly as it used to, that's going to affect your levels of that pharmaceutical medication. So you have to be aware of that. You might have more or less medication in your body as a result of the impact of that herb on your metabolism, on your liver. And then you want to look at the individuality here. Safety is also an individual thing. Of course, poison hemlock, I think, is safe for nobody, but there are herbs that people can be more sensitive to or less sensitive to, depending on who you are and what your all the other parameters are. So just because it's fine for one person doesn't mean that it's perfectly safe for another person. Another thing to think about is therapeutic level. This is one of my issues that I like to take a stand on. It's something that's not talked about very much. People will take herbs, but they don't take them at a therapeutic level. And so they make a decision about whether or not they help based on whatever they took. But let's say, I think we used the example of taking a baby aspirin. And so you do this study of a baby aspirin and you're like, well, I took half a baby aspirin and it didn't help. So baby aspirin or aspirin in general doesn't work. And of course, that's silly because you didn't take enough. The dose was not high enough to create an actual therapeutic effect. The same thing is true with herbs. You may not be creating a therapeutic effect. And so you might throw something out as not working when the issue was you didn't take enough of it or you didn't take it long enough. Sometimes we get so used to the way pharmaceuticals work that we expect results like in a day or two or three. Sometimes you can get results like that with herbs. There are plenty of them that give you fairly quick results, but there are some that don't. And then there's some that can give you some quick results, but the more you take them, the longer you take them, the more results you get. And so you have to figure this out individually. What is therapeutic for you? It's not the same thing as what's therapeutic for your neighbor. Sometimes you might need less, sometimes you might need more. Again, be judicious. Here are a couple quotes that I thought you might like in terms of giving you more of a context. So this is about looking at the process that the herb goes through as it is harvested and then processed to be appropriate for consumption. Not all herbs are just straight up taken as are. A lot of them are made into teas. A lot of them are processed various ways that create different therapeutic effects. And so the herb will be potentially different based on how it is processed. You can look forward to a little bit of a different effect if you have it in a tea or if you have it ground in a capsule or a pill. If you have it in a tincture, let's say the tincture, you're using alcohol to extract the medicinal qualities. You might get different medicinal qualities when you use water to extract those, or when you use glycerin to extract those. There's a whole number of ways that herbs are processed, and those ways affect what impact the herb has and how strong that impact is. So here's this quote: over a period of centuries, crude drugs, so we're talking about basically herbs have been often processed according to specific methods to yield the desired effects. Whether they're simply boiled or heated or mixed with other herbs such as licorice or ginger or black beans, the purpose is often to reduce the toxic side effects or to accentuate the drug's beneficial effect. Thus, for example, aconite, something you don't use unprocessed. So in order to render it less toxic and yet retain the desired cardiac effects, it's usually soaked for days, boiled for hours. And so recent studies have showed under these processing conditions, the most toxic alkaloid, alkanite, can be destroyed or greatly reduced. So the same plant part from the same species, if obtained by different processing methods, can produce widely different pharmacological effects. Okay. There's a whole classification of herb safety. This is super interesting. This whole idea of how the Chinese classify their herbs, very, very interesting. And it's very telling the difference in terms of cultural viewpoint, worldview, when you look at the Chinese classification of safety. They call the non-toxic and what we would call tonic. So a tonic herb is an herb that you can take every single day for the rest of your life, and it will just strengthen you. It just will build your health. And you're not going to get too much of it. You're not going to end up getting toxic in any way. These are it's like carrots. You could eat a carrot every day for the rest of your life, and that will just be helpful. So tonic and non-toxic herbs you can take every single day forever, those are classified as superior. Those are superior herbs. Their inferior herbs are the herbs that are toxic that you only use for short periods of time. And so interestingly, when pharmaceutical companies went looking for herbs to put in their medicines, like think back to heroic medicine and the drama, right? And so pharmaceutical companies wanted what the Chinese would classify as inferior herbs. In other words, the herbs that were very strong, that were toxic, really, or you could only have for short periods until they became toxic. And so you've got very, very carefully managed, strong, powerful herbs that you would never use every day for the rest of your life. Foxglove or digitalis is an example of something with a narrow band of this is useful versus this is going to become poisonous. So that the Chinese classify those as inferior. The ones that are ministerial or sort of in the middle are, depending on the use, not toxic, maybe toxic. You know, they're not nearly as strong and powerfully toxic as the inferior herbs, but also you probably wouldn't take them every day for the rest of your life either. They're not tonic herbs. So a lot of herbs fall into that category. There are quite a few that fall into the superior category. We're going to talk about these in the last 3 weeks of class, which ones fall where. Herbalists have this way of looking at safety in herbs, and you can see similarities. There's normalizers and effectors, things that create normalization in the body, or alternatives, like we mentioned that word a couple days ago. Gentle and strong herbs, potent effectors, think of those as inferior herbs. Potent effectors, they're rarely used. They're used really kind of on special occasion by people who really know what they're doing for individualized reasons. They're not passed out, like sold over the counter kind of things for the general public to just say, oh, let's just take this for fun, like alcohol or other things like that. Anyway, coming right back here to safety. It's hard to identify safety concerns before a drug comes to market. So this is with pharmaceuticals. They'll do a randomized control trial and they'll give it to like 10,000 people. You're like, 10,000 people is a lot, right? It's a lot, but it's still not a lot when it comes to eventual marketing to millions of people. And so there are always side effects that seem to be missed when you're looking at 10,000 people that then become prevalent or problematic when you're administering the pharmaceutical to millions of people. So this is a design challenge in terms of doing the randomized controlled trials, because some of these effects are fairly rare. However, when you've got millions of people, fairly rare effects can crop up. And you see these problems as drugs that were approved go to market, and then all of a sudden they're withdrawn from the market because you have all these people dying or in liver failure or this and that because those drugs turned out to not be safe. So we try to look at safety of pharmaceuticals using randomized controlled trials on large populations, or large samples of the population rather, like 10,000 people. It's still a limited population. You still have underrepresented groups, and it doesn't include true patients. So a lot of times people are screened so well that you're not really looking at actual real clinical use. You're looking at laboratory style use. So these are some of the problems with identifying safety of pharmaceuticals. And then if people want to transfer that over to herbs, you can see now how dissimilar herbs are and how it's just completely not applicable. It won't work in the same way. There's so much variety in the identity of herbs and the quantity, the use, the storage, the harvesting, the potency. All of those things are variables. You make a pharmaceutical, you're making it in a lab, and they're all going to be the same. And that's easy to make them all the same. You just use the formula and boom. An herb, you go look at it. If say it's growing on top of a mountain in the sun, it's going to have a different kind of potency than an herb that's growing in the shade down the hill in a lot of water. If it's the same herb, you're going to have a different action because the way the herb grows is what influences the medicinal action of the herb. So that's what we call secondary metabolites, or those medicinal actions. We'll get to that. So don't stress about that language yet. We'll get there. So to sum up, herbs have a very low risk if you use them correctly. You have problems when some plants are just inherently toxic, like, poison hemlock would be inherently really toxic. Sometimes herbs are contaminated with a whole variety of things. They could be contaminated with chemicals that are in the mixing plant. They could be contaminated in the soil. Some soils have high levels of lead. Sometimes they're adulterated. Things are added to them to make them look better, and that ends up creating all kinds of problems. For example, turmeric is well known for being contaminated or adulterated with things that contain lead. There's a coloring agent that has been added. We're trying to screen this out, but can't be perfect. There's a coloring agent added to turmeric to make it look brighter yellow. And people would think, oh, if it's brighter yellow, it's more natural, it's better for you. But it was the addition of that color and then that lead that came with it that made it bright yellow. And so people would end up having higher lead levels because they're eating turmeric. So contamination can be a problem. Adulteration can be a problem. Sometimes herbs are misidentified. So this is why when you buy herbs, you want to make sure that the company you're buying them from is reputable. You want to make sure that they are a good quality company. There's some out there that have a great reputation, and there are a number out there who are just cheap and who knows what's in there. And then there are places I would never buy herbs, like any box store. I would never buy herbs from there. So I've added some videos to the module, the page for today. These are a few people that I know who recorded some information on how they run their practice. Some variety here in their approach. And what you'll see is going to feel really different from when you go see a doctor. One of the things that you'll notice is there's this overarching concern about the person and the context. They want to know who you are and what is about you. So it's almost more psychology than it is medicine in those ways. Of course, we don't ever say it's actually medicine because I think that's illegal. It's, we can talk about herbal medicine as a construct, but the reality of you're not practicing medicine, you're practicing herbalism. So you're offering healing, you're offering support. You're not offering cures, never. You are not allowed to do that. That is illegal. And so listen to these practitioners and just get kind of a little flavor of what they're like and imagine what it would be like to go to some kind of practitioner like this. These are 3 women I know, and they're all very different in their approach and in their personality and where they're from, et cetera. And so I think that'll be kind of fun. And then next week, we'll talk about science and context. My sense of how these videos will go is that this week were the longest videos, and it will get shorter as we go. So you can look forward to that, I think. All right, see you next week.